For those of you who are new to Zen koans and the koan introspection tradition, this video will give you a brief introduction to it. Of course, koan practice is a vast, millennium-old tradition that could not possibly be covered in a short YouTube video or even a series of videos. But I think if you have just a little sense of the theory and practice of koan introspection, you should find my talks on the cases of the Blue Cliff Record a little more accessible. So, what is a koan? A literal translation of the word koan is public case. A koan is, in a sense, like a precedent-setting legal case that everyone can access and consider. But rather than pointing up legal issues, koans challenge us to open up to new forms of spiritual information. They often take the form of short dialogues between a master and a disciple, and most of those concern the words and actions of Chinese masters who lived during the golden age of Zen, the Tang dynasty. Now, you might think that because most koans are around 1200 years old, they must be stale, stuffy things that have no real relevance to your life. But nothing could be further from the truth. Koans are vital, living, breathing tools for each person who sincerely engages with them as a part of their practice of Zen. Now, the first koan that Zen practitioners begin with is known as the Shokan koan. It's very important. It's a first barrier koan. Often this first barrier koan comes from a collection of koans called the Gateless Gate. And this particular koan reads as follows. A monk, in all seriousness, asked the master Joshu, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" Joshu replied, Mu. Mu here is spelled M-U, and in ancient Chinese this literally meant no or not or nothing. It was a negation. So Joshu appears to be saying that dogs do not have Buddha nature, and this is a problem because that contradicts a fundamental Buddhist teaching, which is that all beings do have Buddha nature, including dogs. So either Joshu is a heretic or his response of mu means something other than the literal meaning of the word. Well, obviously, Joshu is no heretic. So that leaves us with the question, what is the meaning of mu? Or just simply, what is mu? It is tempting to imagine that you can figure out an answer to this question by just thinking really hard about it. You might look for clues in the koan, though there is not much there. And you'll want to try to resolve the koan conceptually, dreaming up philosophical arguments or clever intellectual explanations, much the way you would if you were trying to answer a test question or solve a riddle. So here we have to correct a common misunderstanding about koans. Koans are not riddles. They are also not test questions. They are not thought experiments. They are not philosophical musings. And so unlike these other things, koans cannot be resolved through the ordinary processes of analytical thinking. In fact, koans are designed very deliberately to defy our attempts to resolve them conceptually. They are designed to force an experiential realization about an aspect of reality that most people don't even know exists. So our first koan takes us beyond ordinary thinking, giving us access to this other aspect of reality in a breakthrough experience known as Kensho. The experience of Kensho is often a shattering one in which the practitioner discovers what we call the absolute aspect of reality. Now, conceptually speaking, the absolute is different from our ordinary everyday perspective on the way the world is. That everyday view is often referred to as the relative aspect of reality. So we need to take a closer look at both the relative and absolute aspects of reality, starting with the relative. The relative perspective is our ordinary, everyday way of viewing and functioning in the world. From the relative perspective, everything in the universe can be differentiated from everything else. So hot is different from cold. Cold is different from hot. I am different from you. Right is different from wrong, and so on. From this perspective, we think of ourselves and objects and people in the world as discrete, unique phenomena that do not overlap or commingle. That is, I can say I am a human being and not a dog, and a dog is not a human being. It's just a dog. The tree in my yard is just a tree and not a starfish. This view of reality is perfectly valid, but it is only one half of the story. Now, as I said, most people believe that this relative view of things comprises the entirety of what we call reality. Unfortunately, this belief creates the conditions for all kinds of human suffering. You see, when we believe that the self is different from everything else, then all of our experiences fall into dualistic categories of good and bad, gain and loss, happiness and unhappiness. We believe that it is best to maximize our happiness and minimize our unhappiness. So we attempt to do that through the acquisition of material wealth, social position, fame, and so on. Well, this would all be fine, but for the fact that reality doesn't always cooperate with our desires. We don't always get what we want, or we don't get what we think we deserve. And we can't always avoid the things that we find unpleasant. Consequently, there is always a sense of dissatisfaction with our lives. It may be great, it may be small, subtle, but it's always there. And all of our attempts to assuage that dissatisfaction are exactly those same attempts that produced the dissatisfaction in the first place. So you see, being stuck in the relative becomes kind of a circular, self-defeating system born of our ignorance of the full scope of reality. But there is another side of reality that we call the absolute. From the perspective of the absolute, all things are undifferentiated, unconditioned. We could say they are unborn and undying. From the absolute perspective, therefore, hot is cold, cold is hot. I am you and you are me. A rowboat is a robin. It's also a star, or a rock, or an airplane, or a pile of logs, or a peanut butter sandwich, or a caveman who died 50,000 years ago, or a baby who won't even be conceived until the year 3124. Now, this may sound rather meaningless to you, but getting acquainted with the absolute is necessary if you want to be free of the various forms of self-clinging and suffering that the dualistic thinking of the relative side of things produces. And that's where your first koan will come into play. Your first koan can be thought of as a tool that will help you to go beyond the limits of your relative dualistic habits of thought and open you up to the absolute. Koans do this by short-circuiting our dualistic conceptual thoughts and assumptions, forcing us into a realization about our fundamental unity with the universe. When that realization occurs, the problem or contradiction or paradox that once appeared to be at the heart of the koan will vanish completely. In its place, we will find a perfectly straightforward, non-paradoxical statement about reality and about ourselves. Then, suddenly, there will be nothing that you cannot know. You will no longer be strictly limited by intelligence, education, wealth, or even time and space. Of course, getting to that initial breakthrough requires a lot of time. It requires also a lot of resolve and a lot of patience. And it also requires working with a qualified teacher, someone who really knows the koan curriculum. So let's take a look now at some of these sort of technical considerations of koan introspection practice. First of all, if you want to do koan practice, you probably should begin by developing the ability to enter and sustain a relatively deep level of meditative concentration, what we call samadhi. Zen students commonly develop this ability through practices such as counting the breaths, or watching the breath, or sitting shikantaza, aka just sitting. They may do this for a period of a few years, during which time they acquire some first-hand personal knowledge of how easily the mind can fall into fantasies and daydreams and get distracted. They also acquire the skill to steer the mind back to the object of meditation almost immediately after concentration has wavered. Having a good, stable foundation of mental discipline like this really helps you sustain concentration on a koan. In any case, when starting out with our first koan, we begin by memorizing it word for word. That way we can steadily repeat the koan during meditation or zazen. We repeat the words of the koan quite slowly and carefully, not like a robot, not like a stamping machine, of course, but rather in a careful, step-by-step way as if walking along a tightrope. You know, if you've ever seen highliners walking a suspended length of webbing over a canyon, you'll know what I'm talking about. They concentrate very hard and move very slowly, methodically, meticulously, attending to every nuance of muscular movement, using their arms, or sometimes just their hands, or even just a finger to minutely redistribute their weight over the line. Anyway, the idea is to fully engage with each phrase of the koan as sensitively as possible, hearing it in all its possible dimensions. In a way, we listen to the koan as opposed to thinking of possible answers to it. Often, each phrase of a koan is repeated in conjunction with the breath, particularly the exhalation. If so, we suit the phrases of the koan to our natural breathing, not the other way around. Think of the breath as a river, and the words and phrases of the koan as large, gentle fish floating in its currents. Now, a moment ago, I said we memorize the case word for word. And when we do that, it's very important to get all the words exactly right. And this is because one or more of them may be the key to seeing through the case. This key or keyword, and it's possible there could be more than one in a longer, more complex koan, is known as the wato, a literal translation of which would be word head. Here the word head is meant less like the head on your shoulders and more like the head in the word trailhead. That is, it's the source of the koan, or let's say the central black hole of the spiral galaxy of thought and language. So the wato in the mu koan is, of course, just mu. And we repeat this word mu with every exhalation during meditation. Mu. And we have, as we do that, a kind of focused, questioning attitude going on. To be clear, we're not asking a literal question like, what is mu anymore? We're just focusing on this word mu, but focusing on it in a way that is penetrating, as if we wanted to drill into it physically to see what it's made of. In some koans, the wato may not be quite as obvious as it is in the mu koan. For example, what is the key word in the one-line koan, "Bring me an immovable tree in a heavy wind"? Bring me an immovable tree in a heavy wind. Is the wato bring me? Is it immovable, tree, heavy wind? The only way to determine the wato is to sit with the case, allowing each word to gently rise and sink through your conscious awareness. Eventually, you will recognize the wato almost instinctively. It's kind of like feeling your way around in a dark room. On later examination, you may notice that the Wato is the word that provoked your greatest doubt. And we need to talk about doubt because it's pretty significant. And also frustration, because that comes into play as well. But first of all, when doubt comes up in relation to our efforts to accomplish something in our daily lives, it usually makes us pretty uncomfortable. And quite often our natural tendency is to want to project that doubt onto something outside of ourselves. So when self-doubt arises in koan practice, we may be tempted to project our doubt onto the koan, or our teacher, or Zen, or the world, or our girlfriend, or whatever it happens to be. But make no mistake, how you feel about your koan is about you and no one else. So my advice is this. When self-doubt arises, be brave and face it. You have to be brave. There's just really no alternative. Go into it like there's no tomorrow, because in fact, for you, there may not be a tomorrow. You never know. So you dig into your koan again and again over the course of many periods of zazen, day in and day out, week after week, month after month, and even perhaps year after year. Because the solution does not come easily or quickly. And it's likely, because of that, that you will experience feelings of frustration. Provisionally speaking, we could say that the frustration that arises in koan introspection is a good sign, because even though it's uncomfortable, it means that your conceptual responses to the koan are wearing thin, and you're getting closer to breaking through it. So just keep going. Your time is not being wasted. And it's quite likely during this phase that your mind will throw up clever or more subtle kinds of conceptual responses to your koan, responses that are masquerading as the true answer. This happens because, as Delmore Schwartz once wrote, the ego is always at the wheel. So that is, the ego always wants to preserve the illusion of a self that is separate or special and in control. So it will do whatever it can to make it seem as though you've found the real solution to the koan, when in fact all you've got is a clever intellectual fabrication. So it's this tricky nature of the ego that is why having a qualified teacher help you with koan study is an absolutely indispensable part of the practice. A qualified teacher is someone who has undergone the arduous koan curriculum and has been approved by a teacher who also underwent the curriculum with a similarly qualified teacher. It's typical that a teacher who is qualified to teach koans to have gone through 700 or 800 of them over the course of, typically about 20 years of intensive Zen training. So they have a lot of experience with the various egoistical pitfalls that koan introspection produces. They're in a good position, therefore, to help you avoid kidding yourself, to help you avoid holding up false accomplishments as authentic breakthroughs. The student-teacher relationship is extremely important, and there will be numerous exchanges between each of them. Most of those exchanges taking place during private interviews called dokusan, or if your teacher is a sensei, it might be called daisan. And these start out with the student beginning the interview saying, "My name is such and my koan is, for example, Joshu's mu." The student will then provide a response to their koan. Depending on the koan, the response might be verbal or it might be a physical gesture of some kind, but an acceptable response will always reflect the student's experiential merging with the koan. This could take a very long time. It could potentially take years for your first koan. At that point, really, all your efforts to dream up some clever conceptual response to the koan will basically collapse. Really, that part of you is just going to fail. And once it does, the koan will break open and you will burst through the first barrier. As I mentioned before, this experience is known as Kensho. It's provisionally speaking a first enlightenment experience, also sometimes referred to as an opening. Now you may wonder why anyone would sign up to sit with koans given that it is such a daunting long-term practice, but the answer to that is as simple as saying, after one's initial breakthrough, all one wants urgently is to deepen and clarify that initial opening experience. When you have set a spark to the torch of wisdom, it is only natural that you want to keep that torch burning as brightly as possible. Now I should say that there is more to koans than simply passing them. After passing a koan, you should always ask yourself, how does this koan apply to my life? How does the insight gained from seeing through a koan manifest itself here and now? A few minutes ago, I mentioned the koan, "Bring me an immovable tree in a heavy wind." I love this koan. It's really beautiful. The koan is really all about a tree at one level, of course, but after you have passed it, you see how to handle the heavy winds of your life. That is, the curveballs and the lemons and the roller coasters of emotional being. In other words, even when you're going through tough times, you will know better how to weather the storm. Your branches will not break. You will not be uprooted and thrown onto the ground. You will remain centered, firmly rooted in the Dharma, and ready for anything. But there's even more. When you are an immovable tree, when you see everyone else in similar heavy winds, you know how they feel. You're immovable, but they don't know that yet. They're afraid of those winds. They think that they will break and fall down. And that's when you remember that not so long ago, you too were afraid of those heavy winds. You too worried that one or another of your branches would break off. You worried that you might even become uprooted and destroyed. But because you see that aspect of yourself in others, you are just that much better at feeling true compassion for them. It's not because you're better than them, it's just that you see things from a slightly different perspective. So, koan practice is certainly challenging, but it's a beautiful and transformative practice for which I personally am enormously grateful. I will forever be in debt to my teacher, Susan Myoyu Anderson Roshi. She was just so patient over the course of many years, helping me get through whatever it is, 700 or 800 koans that are in our koan curriculum. I'm really grateful to her for her constant encouragement and her resolve to maintain the highest possible standards of Dharma practice. And as a consequence, my sincere wish is that you too find the courage and the faith and the resolve to embark on the road of koan introspection. After all, what do you have to lose? All right, if you found this video helpful, I hope you would do me the kindness of liking it and subscribing to the channel. And then you'll be in a position to listen to my Teisho on the cases of the Blue Cliff record. Thank you so much for listening.